Right, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Let me just begin with a disclaimer that I am no expert. I have only read the first 14 chapters of the novel, but hopefully can give some general introduction before we get to the chapters themselves. But let's begin with Trollope's own assessment of this novel from his autobiography. I do not know that in any literary effort I ever feel more completely short of my own intention than in this story. It was my purpose to create sympathy for the unfortunate man, who, while endeavouring to do his duty to all around him, should be led constantly astray by his unwillingness to submit his own judgment to the opinion of others. The man is made to be unfortunate enough, and the evil which he does is apparent. So far I did not fail, but the sympathy has not been created yet. I look upon the story as being nearly altogether bad. It is in part redeemed by certain scenes in the house and vicinity of an old maid in Exeter. But a novel which in its main parts is bad cannot in truth be redeemed by the vitality of subordinate characters. It'd be fascinating to come back to whether we agree with him. He Knew He Was Right was written in 1867 and 1868, partly written in the States, where Trollope was part of a post office delegation, serialized between October 68 and May 69, and published in 2 volumes in 1869. It's one of his longest and most intense novels. Trollope had actually resigned from his regular position in the post office in 1867, possibly passed over for promotion. The Last Chronicle of Barset was published in 1867 and maybe marked another transition point. In 68, Trollope stood unsuccessfully as Liberal candidate for Beverley, and perhaps strange with hindsight that someone's fame and reputation alone didn't win him the seat. But it was clearly for him a time of disappointments, of change, and of transition. He received the biggest advance for this novel of any that he wrote, £3,200, worth today about £450,000 and a bit more than $500,000. The advance was never recouped in the sales. I want to mention 3 national events which seem to me to have a bearing on the novel, not all coinciding with its writing, but indicative of how the wind was blowing. One that will have a part in the novel is the wonderfully called 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act, which, if you remember, women lost their property rights at marriage, and it was almost impossible to leave a failed marriage if you were a woman. Now, this act gave women some very limited access to divorce, and it's probably more significant in the fact that a principle was established rather than that floodgates were opened. Adultery was sufficient grounds for a man to divorce his wife, although as a result of this act, he now had to prove it, hence the rise of the private detective, wonderfully characterized in this novel by Mr. Boswell, who we will meet later. A woman had to prove adultery and show that it was aggravated by desertion, or prove bigamy, incest, or rape. It was still the case in society that if a woman quarrelled with her husband and separated, she was assumed to be in the wrong, and if the matter went to court, likely to lose custody of any children, which is a fear that Emily bears very early on and is voiced by others. The second thing, I think, is the 1867 Second Reform Act, which obviously plays a big part in Phineas Finn. It actually increased those eligible to vote from 1.4 million to 2.5, so not a huge percentage of the population yet. The act is more significant again for the opening of possibilities, because in discussion of the Reform Act in Parliament, questions were certainly being asked about the role of men and women in wider society. And at the time in the House of Commons, there was the beginning of pressure for women's suffrage. And so the questions were certainly around. And just thirdly, in 1869, J.S. Mill published The Subjection of Women. He'd written it in 1861. It was thought to have been well known by Trollope, and when it was published, sold very quickly in a number of reprints. And it was Mill who'd agitated, particularly in Parliament, for votes for women. In his writing, he suggested that personal liberty, and especially personal liberty to govern one's own affairs, should apply to men and women. Half the human race, he argued, were unable to contribute to society outside of the home. So I think these ideas were very much around in the sort of society that Trollope moved in and the sort of people who read Trollope's novels. So they were not simply arcane ideas, but actually very pressing questions of the day. So what are the main themes of the novel, as far as I can suggest? Let me suggest 4 for the moment, although I'm sure as the weeks go on, we may add to them. Clearly, this is a novel about jealousy and obsession. At the heart of the novel is a compelling psychological study of obsession and jealousy and its destructive impact, especially on the central character, but also those around him. It's not only Trevelyan, but Emily also displays her own obsessive behaviour, as do a raft of other characters. There is depicted a deep-seated vulnerability which eats at the heart of a marriage, a stubbornness that defies common sense. There are suggestions that this novel is Trollope's Othello. A man marries a wife from a different world and culture. He is morbidly concerned with his reputation. He is irrationally jealous without clear proof or evidence. However, no one in the novel quite has the destructive power of Iago. At the time, there was some criticism of the novel, suggesting that the moral turmoil that arises out of slim and innocuous material doesn't hold water. However, it seems to me that it is precisely the point of the tragedy in Othello and here that if the protagonists could only have been brought together and simple explanations given, all would be well. A contemporary review of the novel in The Spectator actually did commend the novel for this. It said, "There is real genius in the conception of breaking a husband's heart and ruining his mind on so meagre a basis of fact as this, on the absurd foundation of an old gentleman's foppish vanity, a young lady's bitter willfulness, and a self-occupied husband's angry, suspicious, and brooding sense of indignity." And here perhaps is some of the great power of Trollope in being able to show, as perhaps many of us have experienced in our own lives, that it is the trivial that engenders the deeply poisonous. So there is jealousy and obsession. There are then, I think, discussions about love, trust, and fear, because Trollope questions the relationship between husbands and wives, or potential husbands and wives, in this sort of society. The husband has the right to impose his will and demand obedience, is the convention. And that is Emily's duty from Trevelyan's point of view. But how might one distinguish between obedience and subjection, especially in the world that is unfolding in the late 1860s? Interestingly, whether we call them Trollope or the narrator has a view about this in chapter 5. He says, "Wives are bound to obey their husbands, but obedience cannot be exacted from wives as it may be from servants by aid of law with penalties, or from a horse by punishment and manger curtailments." I think the quote is worth saying for that wonderful phrase, manger curtailments, which is a wonderful little statement, I think. So then, as we've seen before, there is something about the role of women. In the society in which Trollope moves and writes, the only apparent role for a woman in this society is to marry and to be beholden to the man she's ended up with. An unmarried woman has only the prospect of a governess or a companion. In a sweeping generalization, working class women did work, usually harsh, physical, low-paid work. Middle class women had very little going for them. It might also be the case about the role of men in the late 1860s as well. Clearly, the professions were available to them: church, law, medicine, and military. But what was a middle-class man with a reliable and significant private income to do, apart from go to his club and hunt? It's hinted more than once that this is part of Trevelyan's problem. Maybe if he'd got a proper job, it wouldn't have come to this. And then again, a familiar Trollope theme from this time, changes in society. And the wonderful old Miss Stanbury in the early chapters voices her concern about the way the world is changing. Trollope says of her, in the matter of politics, she had long since come to think that every good thing was over. All change to her was hateful and unnecessary. If her niece was to come to her as a companion, it's made clear that she is not to read modern novels, nor wear any false hair. Miss Stanbury also has a wonderful tirade about the iron stumps that are sprouting up everywhere, in which people are encouraged to post letters. These are not safe, and the post office is where letters should be deposited for sending, as it always has been. Joking aside from this little caricature, in a changing world, some characters in the novel will navigate their way around modern life more successfully than others. And engaging with that society is a theme that I think will come back again. And so at last, to these first 14 chapters and some brief summary and reflection. Firstly, I think in these chapters, we meet less of the secondary characters than we might in some of Trollope's novels. It makes the focus on Trevelyan and Emily all the more intense. Secondly, it seems to me there's a little sense that in what becomes a deeply intense psychological novel, we almost begin in once upon a time territory. Trevelyan, a rich young man, visits the fictitious Mandarin Islands. He marries Emily, one of the governor's 8 daughters. Neither she nor her father have any money. They also agree to bring her sister Nora back to England with them. Unusually, the main characters have wooed, wed, and had a baby virtually before the novel begins. This is all understood and is almost past history. Marital bliss is interrupted when Colonel Osborne visits Emily at home in London. He is a lifelong family friend of her father's. However, he has a reputation for enjoying the company of pleasant women, and another husband, it is reputed, has taken his wife to Naples to avoid the Colonel's advances. Crucially, Colonel Osborne asks Emily to keep a secret and not tell her husband that he is involved with arrangements that are being made for her father, Sir Marmaduke, to visit England, and Emily agrees not to tell. There are clear early intimation that things are not going to go well. While still in the Mandarins, Emily's parents speak of her thus. Lady Rowley, her mother, was the first to find out that Trevelyan liked to have his own way. But his way is such a good way, said Sir Marmaduke. He will be such a good guide for the girls. But Emily likes her way too, said Lady Rowley. Sir Marmaduke argues the matter no further, but thought that such a husband as Lewis Trevelyan was entitled to have his own way. He probably had not observed his daughter's temper so accurately as his wife had done. Crucially, Trevelyan hears about the plan for her father to come home at his club. It is only a secret between him and Emily. Everyone else knows. An old family friend on his side, the Dowager Lady Milborough, out of concern for Trevelyan, warns him about Colonel Osborne visiting Emily. There is nothing he likes so much as going about and making mischief among men and their wives. With someone more rational, it might have been helpful advice, but it provokes Trevelyan into violent verbal confrontation with his wife, and shows wonderfully, I think, the way in which an innocent remark provokes deep-seated feelings in a vulnerable man. There is then a pause in the tension as we're introduced to the dilemma facing Nora, Emily's sister, who has come with her. Her suitor is the rich and successful Honourable Charles Glascock, who is everything a woman could need. She, however, is attracted by Hugh Stanbury, the nephew of Jemima Stanbury, of whom more in a moment. Jemima has paid for Hugh's education and training as a lawyer. However, she has now cut off his allowance, not having made it as a lawyer. He is now working, as of all things, as a journalist, and for the 1 penny Daily Record, and not even for a proper 6 penny or 3 penny paper. Should Nora go for the prosperous or the penniless? Trollope's insight into the plight of the unmarried woman is powerful at this point. Nora ponders to be poor alone, to have to live without a husband, to look forward to a life in which there would be nothing of a career, almost nothing to do, to await the vacuity of an existence in which she would be useful to no one, was a destiny which she could teach herself to endure, because it might probably be forced upon her by necessity. Chapters 5 and 6 return to the intense development of the quarrel and the extent to which Trevelyan has been possessed by jealousy. Ironically, he does not suspect Emily of any wrongdoing at this point, but it is the whispers and rumours that are poisoning him, and the effect as he sees it on his reputation, as he descends into self-pity. He had given her his heart and his hand and his house, and had asked for nothing in return, but that she should be all in all to him, and that he should be her one God on earth. He will not see her now until she backs down and submits to his will about not seeing Colonel Osborne. She will not formally accede until he apologizes for the way in which he has treated her. Nora, in chapter 6, tries to effect a reconciliation, but to no avail. And Trevelyan now has a new dilemma. If Emily completely ignores Colonel Osborne, this too will have an effect on Trevelyan's reputation. There is a deep impasse between them. Emily's parting words to Trevelyan make this clear. After they have professed they do love one another, she says, "Without love, Louis, you and I cannot be happy, but love alone will not make us so. There must be trust, and there must also be forbearance." His reflection on this is that she was still hard and cold, and still assumed a tone which seemed to imply she had manifestly been the injured person. The intensity is relieved again in chapters 7 and 8, when we meet the formidable Jemima Stanbury, she of the no modern novels or false hair. She's a very wealthy woman living in Exeter, the owner of several properties in the city and highly connected. Her wealth had come from her most strangely when her estranged fiancé died and left her everything. Her sister-in-law, Mrs. Stanbury, and widow of the recent vicar of Nuncombe Putney, lives impecuniously in that village with her two daughters, Priscilla and Dorothy, neither of whom have any money or prospects either. Jemima summons by letter that one of them, Dorothy, should come and live with her as her companion in Exeter, but such is the fate of the unmarried Victorian young woman of humble means. In chapter 9, Hugh Stanbury, who'd been an old college friend of Trevelyan, attempts at Emily's request to effect some reconciliation. Emily is actually still confused as to whether or not she should still be seeing Colonel Osborne or not, but we are led to believe that notes frequently passed between them unknown to her husband. Trollope again offers his view of Emily at this point. In the matter of the quarrel, as it had hitherto progressed, the husband had perhaps been more in the wrong than his wife, but the wife, in spite of all her promises to perfect obedience, had proved herself to be a woman very hard to manage. Trevelyan does not want Hugh's interference when he finally tracks him down at his club, and is not interested in him acting as a go-between. And when dismissed, Hugh reflects on Trevelyan. It is always the same with him, a desire for mastery, which he did not know how to use when he had obtained it. Chapters 10 and 11 describe a new intensity to the quarrel, although interestingly begins with Trollope's view of Colonel Osborne. He had a certain pleasure in being the confidential friend of a very pretty woman, and when he had heard that pretty woman's husband was jealous, the pleasure was enhanced rather than otherwise. Trevelyan and Emily traverse familiar ground, but with an ever-deepening bitterness. She is willing to obey, but asserts that she has been ill-used and requires Trevelyan to apologize. There is renewed focus on Colonel Osborne, and Trevelyan now asserts that he wants her to promise that he will have nothing to do with him. Nora thinks that Emily should give way, but Emily evermore digs her heels in. I will obey him, but as for submitting to him and letting him suppose that I think he is right, never. Trollope reflects on the one-sided nature of such disputes in general. It's all very well for a man to talk about his name and his honour, but it is the woman's honour and the woman's name that are in truth placed in jeopardy. Let the woman do what she will. The man can in truth show his face in the world, and after a while does show his face, but the woman may be compelled to veil hers, either by her own fault or his. The next person to come and try their luck is Lady Milborough. She meets with Emily, sent by Trevelyan to try and help her to see straight. She offers Emily conventional wisdom. A husband has a right to expect some submission from his wife. But in a masterful exchange, Emily gets the better of her. It has come to the point that Trevelyan and Emily are to live apart. Trevelyan stipulates that it must be in the country, anywhere she pleases, but not in London. And she is not to see Colonel Osborne. And she is relieved that at present, the baby is not going to be taken away from her. This synopsis, I think, does not do justice to Trollope's skill in two people who cannot and will not reconcile, going round and round the same territory. On the surface, the issues are trivial, as they usually are. But perhaps we've established that whatever the issue that is under discussion, the fault lines run much deeper. Trevelyan is obsessed and Emily is intransigent, such that neither Hugh nor Nora nor Lady Milborough have any hope or chance of moving things forward, because such is the state of affairs. Lady Milborough is still pressing Emily to apologise. Emily writes again to Colonel Osborne, and Lady Milborough thinks that Emily should be taken to Naples, which is clearly her answer for everything. Lady Milborough also continues to be keen that Nora should marry Mr. Glascock and suggests he visits her. He proposes and she refuses. Nora recognises that he is a gentleman, has wealth, a good name, and an inheritance to follow. However, she does not love him and compares him unfavourably in her eyes with the penniless Hugh. She acknowledges that she had been taught from a very early age that all the material prosperity of her life must depend on matrimony. Yet for Nora, she recognises that she gives this up for her as yet unexpressed and imagined feelings about Hugh. Chapters 12 and 14 take us back to Exeter. Miss Stanbury has with some genuine grace allowed Hugh to visit his sister Dorothy. He brings news that Emily, Nora, and the child are to come and live at Nuncombe Putney with his mother and Priscilla. Priscilla thought that when a man was to be separated from his wife, the woman must be in the wrong. Trevelyan will finance their stay on a year's agreement. He still protests his innocence. I do not think that I have displayed any temper to which a woman has a right to object. Their London home is given up, their furniture is in storage, and Trevelyan goes into lodgings. Lady Milborough reflects to her old friend Mrs. Fairfax, there never were two young people so insane since the world began. And there we come to the end of our chapters.